Today I'm responding to another live stream from a Muslim channel that has now spent 3 consecutive weeks defending slavery and concubinage. Ironically, they began the live stream by saying they don't really want to keep discussing the topic because it keeps coming up. They argue that Islam did not invent slavery, but inherited an existing institution and gradually improved it. According to them, Islam gave slaves rights, encouraged their emancipation through various legal mechanisms, treated them as human beings instead of animals, and therefore should be praised rather than criticized. One caller tries to steer the conversation toward another issue, but almost the entire live stream returns to defending slavery and female captives. I actually want to begin by giving these speakers some credit. Many Muslim speakers avoid this subject altogether. They change the topic, dismiss it in 2 minutes, or pretend it's not important. These gentlemen are at least willing to spend hours discussing one of the most difficult moral questions in Islam. I strongly disagree with virtually everything they argue, but I respect the fact that they are willing to engage. That said, I think their entire defense misses the real issue. The question is not whether slavery already existed. The question is not whether Islam improved slavery. The question is not whether slaves were treated better than before. The real question is much simpler. Would a perfectly merciful and morally perfect God ever permit men to have sex with women they owned as property? Everything else is secondary. Throughout the live stream, the speakers repeatedly say that Islam gradually abolished slavery. I have to be honest, I don't think that claim survives scrutiny. If Islam were gradually abolishing slavery, why were new slaves still being created? Muhammad's community continued taking captives after battles. Women who had previously been free became slaves after their communities were defeated. So while slaves could sometimes be freed, new slaves also entered the system. That does not look like a gradual abolition to me. But here's something interesting. Even if I grant every single one of their arguments for the sake of discussion, even if I grant that slavery already existed, even if I grant that Islam improved conditions, even if I grant that Islam encouraged freeing slaves, I still arrive at exactly the same question. Why permit concubinage? This is where I think the discussion becomes impossible to avoid. The Qur'an says in Surah 4.24 that married women are forbidden, except those whom your right hands possess. That is, female captives. Now, I want to perform a very simple thought experiment. Imagine Allah had instead revealed the following verse. Forbidden are all married women. That is the decree of Allah upon you. That's it. No exception, no qualification, no reference to female captives. Now I want to ask one question. Would that be a worse verse? Would the world become morally worse if Allah simply had prohibited all sexual relations with married women, including women captured during war? I don't think so. In fact, I think that would be a morally superior verse, which raises a very uncomfortable question. If I can imagine a morally cleaner verse of Quran 4.24, why couldn't Allah? Remember, we're not talking about an ordinary human author. We're talking about the creator of the universe, an all-powerful, all-knowing God, a perfectly merciful God. Such a being is not limited by 7th century culture. He isn't forced to compromise with society. He isn't weak. He isn't politically constrained. He doesn't have to say, well, abolishing this would just be too difficult right now. That's how human lawmakers think. He's not an omnipotent God. I've heard many Muslims argue that society was not ready, that slavery had to disappear gradually. But Allah is not dependent on society. Allah created society. If Allah can command people to pray 5 times a day, if Allah can prohibit pork, if Allah can gradually prohibit alcohol, then surely Allah can say captive women are not sexual property. Instead, the Quran contains an exception, and that exception matters. Because once you strip away the legal terminology, I think we should be honest about what we're talking about. These women had not chosen these men. Many had just watched their husbands die. Many had lost their fathers, brothers, sons, and entire families. They had been captured in war. They were now legally owned by the victorious side. Can someone in that position meaningfully refuse? Can property freely withhold consent from its owner? From my perspective, the answer is no. And if meaningful consent is impossible, then calling it consensual sex becomes impossible as well. That's why I believe concubinage is not simply another form of marriage. It is sexual access made possible by ownership, and I cannot reconcile that with a perfectly merciful God. One observation from Ghalib Kamal really stayed with me. He asked a fascinating question. Why does the discussion seem so focused on the concerns of the male soldiers? Think about the perspective of the captive woman. Your home has been destroyed. Your husband has just been killed. Your family may be gone. Your entire world has collapsed. Now ask yourself, what is Allah's primary concern in this passage? Does Allah first reassure the women? Does He command their release? Does He forbid treating them as sexual property? Or is the discussion primarily about resolving the concerns of the victorious men? That question has haunted me, because if Allah is truly the Lord of all humanity, I would expect His concern to extend equally to the powerless, the defeated, and the vulnerable, not just to the victorious army. Finally, there's one thing I found fascinating about this live stream. The speakers repeatedly said that Islam gradually abolished slavery. I've heard countless Muslim apologists make similar arguments over the years, and that itself makes me wonder, why? If this teaching is morally beautiful, why do so many people feel the need to soften it? Why not simply say, yes, Allah permitted concubinage, and that permission is morally perfect? Instead, I often hear, it wasn't really slavery. It was different back then. They had rights. It was gradual. It was better than what existed before. Notice what's happening. The discussion shifts away from defending the actual permission and toward explaining why we should not judge it too harshly. To me, that says something important. Because if a teaching genuinely reflected the wisdom of a perfectly merciful God, I wouldn't expect us to spend so much time explaining why it isn't as bad as it sounds. I would expect us to admire it immediately. For me, this issue has become surprisingly simple. The question is not whether Islam was better than 7th century Arabia. The question is whether this is what I would expect from a perfectly good God. When I read Qur'an 4.24, I don't see a timeless moral revelation. I see what looks remarkably like a 7th century legal solution to a 7th century problem, and that's precisely why I no longer believe this verse came from God.